Dawn broke over the channel like the lifting of a curtain, grey, hesitant, and heavy with rain. The sea rolled in slow, uneven breaths beneath the weight of the storm, its surface veiled by mist and salt. Along the bluffs above Omaha Beach, men of the German 352nd Infantry Division stared into that emptiness, their eyes stinging from wind and sleeplessness. To them, the sea was a wall, and beyond it, nothing but England and rumour. Then, out of the fog, the horizon thickened. At first it seemed a mirage, distant smudges on the water, too many to count. But within moments the smudges became forms, ships, rows upon rows of them, stretching farther than sight could reach, transports, destroyers, landing craft, the largest armada in human history, advancing with mechanical patience toward the French coast. The men in the bunkers whispered to each other in disbelief. 5,000 Schiffe, unmöglich, 5,000 ships, impossible. Inside the reinforced nests of the Atlantic Wall, officers leaned over their rangefinders and field glasses. Orders murmured through radio static. Mortars were checked, machine guns loaded. Each MG-42 was pre-sighted, each trench measured, each field of fire mapped to the meter. They had built this fortress for this very hour. The engineers who poured its concrete had sworn it would hold for 1,000 years. The smell of oil and damp stone filled the air as the defenders took their posts. Beneath their helmets, they were confident, even serene. They had seen maps, charts, calculations. They trusted in their angles, their wire, their minds. They believed no man could cross this beach alive. Yet belief, as history would prove, is brittle when tested against will. As the thunder of naval guns began to roll across the surf, a faint tremor passed through the earth and through their certainty alike. They had built a wall of stone and steel, but what was coming across that gray sea was something else entirely, and within the hour, the beach they thought could not fall would begin to bleed. Aboard the USS Samuel Chase, the night air was thick with diesel and salt. The men of the 1st Infantry Division stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim light below deck, their faces pale beneath the red glow of the lamps. Hours remained before dawn, yet time had already narrowed to a single heartbeat, the moment when the ramps would drop. Chaplains moved quietly between the rows, their words half prayer, half farewell. Each man carried a small piece of home sealed in waxed paper, a letter, a photograph, a folded scrap of faith meant to survive what they might not. The sound of engines thrummed through the hull, steady and relentless. Above, the ship's loudspeakers cracked with brief coded orders. It was no longer a question of if they would land, but how many would reach the sand alive. In the wardroom, officers traced maps already outdated by the hour. Wind had shifted, currents had pushed the fleet off course, yet their tone remained composed, mechanical. "You will face fire like never before," one briefed, "but the world is watching." They believed that courage, drilled into men and measured by schedule, could overcome the chaos of war. Precision, they thought, could be a weapon. On the upper deck, soldiers leaned against the rails, staring toward a horizon they could not yet see. The sea was black, the waves breaking into white ribbons under the moon. Some whispered to each other. Others stared at family photographs, a wife in spring light, a child in Sunday clothes. In those faces, they found a reason to keep breathing through the fear. Then the call came. "Man your stations." Steel doors clanged open. The roar of the engines deepened as the first Higgins boats were lowered into the surf. Ropes strained, hulls slammed against the waves. The smell of gasoline mixed with salt and anticipation. Each descent felt final, the slow drop from order into uncertainty. They believed in the promise of coordination, the symmetry of clocks and timetables, the illusion that history could be engineered like machinery, but the sea cared little for plans. And as the first boats drifted toward the invisible shore, the men aboard began to sense what history never promises, that control ends where courage begins. At EO 6:30, the ramps dropped. For a heartbeat, there was silence, only the hiss of the surf and the thrum of engines. Then, the world erupted, the air filled with the metallic scream of machine guns and the tearing of water struck by bullets. Men stepped forward into flame and ocean, their boots sinking into a tide already red with loss. German MG-42s fired from hidden embrasures cut through the mist, raking the sea in perfect geometry. Every 10 seconds, 1,200 rounds left the barrels, each one a line drawn across the water, erasing a name. Within moments, entire platoons were reduced to fragments of memory. Helmets spun empty across the waves. Rifles sank from nerveless hands. Radio channels broke into chaos, static, shouting, silence. Commanders tried to call the next assault, but the wires were gone, the officers gone with them. In minutes, coordination dissolved into instinct. The landing craft behind, seeing the slaughter ahead, veered off course. Others burned where they floated, gasoline and fire mingling into a single blinding horizon. Medics crawled through surf and smoke, dragging men by their collars, praying for a lull that never came. A stretcher team was hit mid-stride. A signalman vanished beneath the tide. The sea itself became the enemy, cold, choking, endless. Those who reached the shallows found no cover, only open sand and the sound of impact. By 07 Mayu, the first wave was broken. The 1st and 29th Divisions had been reduced to clusters of men clinging to obstacles, to fragments of metal, to anything that floated. Omaha was no longer a landing zone. It was a graveyard before it became a battlefield. And yet, among the wreckage and fire, a few still moved, slowly, stubbornly, crawling forward through the storm. Because even as plans burned and orders failed, something older than strategy began to take hold, the will to survive. Beyond the smoke, the second wave was already approaching. They would find no clear path, only the truth left behind by the first. In 1942, the western coast of Europe became a construction site of fear. From Norway to the Bay of Biscay, engineers of Organization Todt carved bunkers into the cliffs and laid mines beneath the sand. They called it the Atlantic Wall, a fortress stretching more than 2,600 kilometers, 15,000 concrete emplacements, 6 million mines. 50 million tons of steel and stone fused into what Hitler believed was the edge of an unbreakable empire. In Paris, blueprints were drawn not merely as fortifications, but as monuments to permanence. Hitler himself envisioned the wall as proof that his Reich could not be invaded, that geography could be bent into ideology. He boasted that the beaches would swallow the enemy whole. But behind the rhetoric lay urgency and exhaustion. Allied bombers were pounding the French interior. German divisions were bleeding on the Eastern Front. The wall was a promise to mask a growing weakness. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was assigned to inspect the defenses in late 1943, he found little comfort in the illusion. The Desert Fox, a soldier who understood the speed of war, walked the beaches of Normandy with a critical eye. He saw gaps, unfinished emplacements, empty gun pits, and mines still stacked in crates. To him, the ocean was not a barrier but an open door, and he knew that when the Allies came, they would come with overwhelming force. Rommel ordered new fortifications built by hand, day and night. He demanded beach obstacles capable of tearing the hulls of landing craft, and artillery calibrated to converge on the shallow approaches. At Omaha, every bunker was pre-sighted to overlap with its neighbor, creating a web of intersecting fire. He believed that if the first wave could be destroyed in the water, the invasion would drown before it began. "The first 24 hours," he said, "will decide the fate of Europe." But for all his precision, even Rommel could not escape the atmosphere of faith that surrounded the wall. Within headquarters, officers recited doctrine with near-religious certainty. "The sea will defend us." The phrase appeared in memoranda, speeches, and even painted on concrete. The wall was no longer merely fortification, it was dogma, and like all dogma, it blinded those who built it. They saw stone as stronger than spirit, and statistics as stronger than chance. What they could not see was that war, by its nature, seeks the cracks, and somewhere, beyond the horizon, those cracks were already forming. Across the Channel, war was no longer seen as chaos. It was treated as a science. In the months leading to June 1944, the Allies built not only armies, but an equation. In offices from London to Portsmouth, planners surrounded by maps and instruments reduced the invasion of Europe to lines, angles, and tides. The beaches of Normandy were transformed into variables on a blackboard. Every contour, every current, every grain of sand was measured, catalogued, and plotted. Engineers worked in secrecy under code names as strange as the inventions they produced. Hobart's funnies, floating tanks, mine-clearing rollers, flame projectors, machines meant to turn physics into salvation. At Portsmouth, draftsmen designed Mulberry Harbours, vast artificial ports that could be towed across the sea and assembled like Lego in enemy surf. Scientists tested rocket barrages and underwater pipelines. Mathematicians calculated trajectories. Meteorologists traced wind patterns. Even sand samples were stolen from Normandy's coast to test the load-bearing limits of each beach. To the planners, invasion became precision. They spoke of calculated risk, of mathematical certainty. It was a new language of war, born from the industrial age, cold, confident, and logical. Nothing, they believed, would be left to chance. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, CHEF, released timetables where every minute was accounted for, every unit synchronized to the clock. The landing would begin at 06:30. Victory, by their numbers, would follow by noon. But the Channel had its own mind. The same sea that had sheltered England for centuries began to rebel against calculation. On June 4th, gale-force winds tore through the western approaches. Waves rose higher than the landing craft could endure. Aircraft were grounded. Landing zones vanished beneath cloud and rain. The equation began to break. In a bunker at Southwick House, General Eisenhower listened to his meteorologists argue over barometric pressure and the movement of a single low-pressure cell. Hours passed. Reports conflicted. A single error could doom 150,000 men. Yet one meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, believed a small weather window would open on June 6th. It was a forecast built on instinct as much as data. Eisenhower stared at the maps, then simply said, "Okay, let's go." The most complex operation in military history would begin not because the numbers aligned, but because one man decided to trust the sky. The invasion had been planned by engineers, mathematicians, and scientists, but the sea, indifferent to their logic, had already made its first move, and as the storm began to clear, no one knew that its brief calm would shape the fate of the century. At dawn on June 6th, the horizon lit with fire. 13 battleships, 7 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers opened their guns across the Channel, the thunder rolling like the collapse of a continent. From the decks of the USS Texas and HMS Belfast, salvo after salvo arced toward the French coast, the air filled with smoke, the sea with echoes. Sailors watched through binoculars as plumes of earth and concrete leapt skyward. To them, it seemed nothing could survive. For nearly 2 hours, the barrage continued, 40,000 shells hurled at the shoreline. Observers aboard the ships peered through drifting clouds of cordite and claimed the beach was flattened. Radio messages carried a note of triumph. Defenses neutralized. In the calm between detonations, officers allowed themselves to believe the impossible, that the Atlantic Wall had been erased by mathematics and gunpowder. But beneath the smoke, the truth remained buried. The German bunkers, many carved into limestone or shielded by reinforced concrete, lay hidden beneath meters of rock. Observation posts, half submerged in the cliffs, absorbed the blasts like deep-rooted trees weathering a storm. The barrage that looked apocalyptic from afar had only scraped the surface. Inside the shelters, the men of the 342nd Infantry waited, counting seconds by the trembling of the walls. When the naval guns finally lifted their aim to make way for the incoming landing craft, a sudden stillness fell over the coast. The thunder ceased. Dust drifted back toward the sea. Through narrow firing slits, German gunners emerged, shaking debris from their hair, clearing the barrels of their weapons. They had survived the end of the world, and now they prepared to answer it. Out on the water, soldiers aboard the landing craft mistook that silence for victory. The sound of the bombardment had comforted them, its violence a promise that the enemy was already broken. Now, as the boats pitched through the waves under the dull gray sky, the absence of explosions felt like reassurance. Men spoke louder, helmets tilted upward. "Looks clear," someone said. "We've done it." But silence, in war, is the most deceptive sound of all. It tempts belief, conceals intent, and lures men forward into its depths. The Allied fleet had fired its opening act with scientific precision, yet what it revealed was not triumph, but illusion. The sea was calm again, the smoke beginning to fade, the coastline almost peaceful, and beyond that peace, behind those unbroken cliffs, the gunners were already taking aim. In the next hour, the lie of silence would be shattered, and the world would learn what waited when the guns began to speak again. They came ashore through fire. What had been planned as geometry and timing had become a storm of chaos, noise, smoke, and death without pattern. The survivors of the first wave clawed through the surf, using the jagged steel of beach obstacles for cover. Bullets hissed off the water like rain against stone. The air reeked of salt, cordite, and burning fuel. Every movement forward was paid for in blood. The tide was rising. Corpses drifted beside the living. Engineers, burdened with satchels of explosives, stumbled through waist-deep surf toward the mined shoreline. They had trained for months to clear obstacles in sequence, but now sequence meant nothing. Mortars exploded among them, sending arcs of sand into the air. Of every 2 engineers who reached the shore, 1 did not rise again. Yet they kept crawling, hands shaking as they pressed detonators into the wet sand. Lines of fire leapt upward as mines blew apart, carving narrow corridors through the inferno. Company commanders tried to rally their men, but the sea swallowed their voices. Radios had been lost, maps drenched and useless. Some officers drowned under the weight of their equipment before even drawing their pistols. Leadership dissolved as quickly as it had been organized. The chain of command, so carefully constructed across months of planning, was erased within minutes by smoke and confusion. On the beach, the beachmasters, the officers tasked with orchestrating the landing, found themselves surrounded by chaos beyond control. Landmarks were invisible under the haze of bombardment. Landing craft drifted off course. Units meant for different sectors collided, their men clinging to shattered obstacles or crawling into craters that offered fleeting cover. Orders vanished into the wind. What remained was instinct. Here, the war ceased to be about generals and plans. It became a contest of will between individual men and the impossible. Riflemen advanced in groups of 3 or 4, dragging wounded comrades behind them. A private used his bayonet to cut through barbed wire, while machine gun fire tore the air inches above his head. Another soldier, trapped behind a hedgehog obstacle, fired upward without seeing his target, only the muzzle flashes on the ridge. Each act of movement was its own decision, its own defiance. Every meter gained was bought with dozens of lives. The beach was no longer a place of arrival. It was a purgatory between sea and shore. Those who reached the shingle collapsed beside the bodies of those who had not. They had no sense of victory, only survival. The grand design of invasion had narrowed to the crawl of a single man, soaked in seawater, pressing himself against the earth to avoid the next burst of fire. And yet, in that crawl, the invasion endured. The wall had not broken, but it was bending, inch by inch, body by body. In the absence of orders, courage had become the only strategy. By mid-morning, the first thin line of soldiers had reached the base of the cliffs. They could not know who else had made it, nor what waited above. They only knew that retreat was impossible, and that silence behind them meant the boats were still coming. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a new sound began to rise, the slow grinding of tracks against rock. The tanks were coming ashore. Whether they arrived in time, no one could yet say. By mid-morning, Omaha was a landscape of wreckage. The tide had turned crimson and thick with debris. Helmets, rifles, shattered boats, bodies drifting among the surf. Yet amid the ruin, something unseen began to take shape. Pinned behind the sand ridges and shingle banks, scattered groups of survivors, men without orders, officers, or bearings, began to move again. Not forward in formation, but forward nonetheless. The beach, moments earlier, a graveyard, was starting to fight back. Small clusters of infantry crawled through the dunes, guided not by command, but by the sound of one another's rifles. A corporal shouted for cover fire, a sergeant pointed to a break in the wire, and slowly, almost invisibly, the chaos began to find rhythm. What high command could not coordinate, necessity now forged from instinct. The men of the 1st and 29th Divisions, half-deafened and exhausted, were inventing their own war. Out at sea, destroyers watched the slaughter unfold through drifting smoke. Official orders kept them miles from shore, their guns meant for distant bombardment. But on the bridges of ships like the USS Karmic and USS Satterlee, captains made a decision born of both fury and conscience. They turned their vessels toward the beach. At less than 1,000 yards, the great ships came broadside, so close that German gunners could see the white of their hull numbers through the haze. Their 5-inch guns opened fire directly into the cliffside bunkers, point blank, each blast shaking the shoreline like thunder underfoot. For the soldiers pinned below, the sight of those ships swinging inland was like a promise. As shells tore into the bluffs, German machine gun nests vanished in clouds of dust and flame. Still, not all could be reached by naval guns. The rest would have to be taken by hand. Combat engineers, many already wounded, crawled forward with bundles of explosives lashed to poles. Bangalore torpedoes improvised from spare tubing and detonation cord. Others carried satchel charges, throwing them into bunker apertures before diving flat into the sand. It was not elegant nor efficient. It was survival reduced to craft. One obstacle at a time, one bunker at a time, the Atlantic wall began to fracture. Officers lay dead or unreachable, so command fell to whoever could still stand. Sergeants led by gesture and grit, Corporals took up maps soaked in seawater. Privates passed ammunition to men they had never met. War had become democracy by necessity. Decisions made not by rank, but by courage. Each man became his own strategist, guided by the single idea that standing still meant dying where he stood. Radios, clogged with static and seawater, fell silent. Instead, men on the beach raised colored smoke grenades to mark German strongpoints. From the ships offshore, observers used those drifting clouds to adjust fire. A purple plume meant a bunker still firing. Yellow meant friendly positions. Red meant the path was open. Communication by color, the last language left in a battle that had lost its voice. By noon, momentum, barely perceptible at first, had shifted. The tide was carrying the wounded back out to sea, but the living were crawling forward over the bodies of the fallen. Engineers cleared lanes for the tanks that had finally made it ashore. One Sherman, half submerged, fired directly into the entrance of a machine gun nest, its gunner shouting coordinates to infantry, who answered with smoke signals and hand gestures. No plan remained, only persistence did. The same discipline that had built the invasion now gave way to improvisation, and through that improvisation, order began to return. The beach was no longer a slaughterhouse. It was becoming a front. By early afternoon, a few hard-won breaches opened in the German line. The wall, thought indestructible, had been cracked by men who refused to stop crawling. And as the last destroyer withdrew to reload, its captain looked through the smoke toward the cliffs and murmured what every man on that shore already knew. The tide had finally turned, but above the bluffs, untouched by the guns, the next challenge waited in silence. By midday, the sea had withdrawn, leaving behind a field of ruin. Smoke drifted across the coastline, thin as gauze, revealing what hours of battle had disguised: the cliffs that loomed above Omaha. Jagged, sheer, and blackened by shellfire, they stood as the last barrier between survival and annihilation. For the men on the beach, there was no longer a plan, only the instinct to go up. At Pont du Hoc, 2 miles to the west, the 2nd Ranger Battalion had already begun the impossible. Their mission, to scale a 100-foot cliff under direct fire and silence the German guns positioned above. Using ropes fired from rocket launchers, the Rangers clawed their way upward, boots slipping on wet stone, knives and fingers digging into cracks slick with seawater. Grenades rained down from the lip of the bluff. Some ropes burned, others snapped. Men fell and were replaced by those behind them. Inch by inch, they climbed through smoke and splinters, driven not by orders but by momentum, the pure refusal to stop. Elsewhere along the beach, small groups of infantry began to flank the heights through narrow ravines known as draws, E1 and F1, natural corridors carved by centuries of erosion. They had been marked on the invasion maps as potential routes inland, but few expected anyone to reach them alive. Now, crawling through mud and shattered concrete, they became lifelines. Engineers cleared wire with bare hands. Riflemen fired upward at muzzle flashes hidden among the rocks. Every step forward was contested by unseen fire. When the first soldiers reached the base of the bluff, they found trenches dug into the slopes like veins. There was no time to organize, no thought of formation. Men hurled grenades blindly over ridgelines, then surged upward in short bursts. Climb, shoot, climb again. German defenders fought from dugouts and casemates, but the pressure never relented. Each fallen gunner was replaced by another, each assault closer than the last. It was war at a distance of meters, fought with knives, bayonets, and the weight of exhaustion. By early afternoon, a handful of Rangers stood at the crest. They were soaked, bleeding, and almost out of ammunition. Below them, the beach was still smoldering. Above, the landscape of the Atlantic Wall stretched silent and broken. German gunners, cut off and disoriented, began to retreat inland. Snipers, once invisible, were hunted through the ruins of their own fortifications. Their shots came slower, then stopped altogether. The men at the top planted their rifles into the earth as markers for those still climbing. The cliff that had once defined the boundary of invasion was now behind them. For the first time since dawn, there was open ground ahead. Messages sent back to the ships were brief and understated. Pointe du Hoc, taken. Yet those 4 words carried the weight of the entire front. Along the rest of the beach, the pattern repeated, chaos giving way to momentum, despair giving way to endurance. The Atlantic Wall, years in the making, began to fracture under the strain of persistence. Bunkers that had withstood hours of bombardment fell to grenades tossed through narrow embrasures. What could not be outplanned was simply outlasted. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the bluffs that had defined German invincibility were crawling with Allied flags and wounded men. The wall still stood in pieces, but its myth was gone. The defenders had learned what the architects of the Reich never understood, that no fortress is absolute once the human will decide to climb it. And as the survivors of the morning looked inland toward the hedgerows of Normandy, they realized the hardest part was yet to come. The beach had been taken, but the war for Europe was only beginning. By 10:00 a.m., the horizon thundered again. Naval guns, silent since the first waves, reopened their barrage. The destroyers that had risked everything earlier in the morning now fired with reckless precision into the high ground above Omaha. The shells struck with the sound of a closing door, each impact collapsing another fragment of the German line. The bluffs that had spat fire for hours were now cloaked in smoke and dust, their defenders buried or broken within. On the beaches below, movement returned to the living. The tide, swollen with debris and bodies, pulled back from the sand, revealing the shape of victory beneath the ruin. From the surf emerged the tanks, the long-delayed Shermans that had drifted off course, or sunk before touching land. Of the 29 sent toward the sector, barely half survived the crossing. Some crawled forward belching black smoke, others burned quietly in the shallows, their crews still inside. But those that reached the beach began to change everything. A single tank lumbered through the wire at Easy Red sector. Its tracks tearing through obstacles meant to stop an army. Behind it, infantry surged, following in its wake like a shadow. The once static front line began to move, not in formation, but in fragments, squads advancing yard by yard through smoke, ditches, and shattered trenches. The sound of fire grew uneven. For the first time all morning, the German guns hesitated. Inside the bunkers, the defenders were running low. Ammunition belts were empty, radios silent. Units that had once fought in perfect coordination were now isolated pockets, cut off, surrounded, and blind. Some tried to retreat through the maze of tunnels linking their emplacements. Others simply laid down their weapons and stared toward the sea. They had fought for hours believing the invasion would collapse in the surf. Now it was their own lines collapsing beneath them. On the upper slopes, fragments of the 116th Infantry Regiment began to link up. Men who had landed in separate waves, who had crawled through chaos without command, now found each other by voice alone. "Ranger!" "Fox Company!" calls echoed through the smoke until the scattered became a unit once more. Together they pushed upward, bayonets fixed, through the final ditches of the Atlantic Wall. The last resistance came from a single machine gun firing down the slope. A grenade silenced it. The way forward was open. At 10:30, a private, his name lost in the blur of history, reached the crest of the bluff and unfurled a small American flag torn from a ration box. It caught the wind above the ruins, its fabric blackened with soot. There was no cheer, no salute, only silence, the quiet recognition that the impossible had been done. Beneath that makeshift banner lay the cost, more than 2,000 men killed or missing within the first 6 hours. From the sea, the commanders who had watched the battle unfold through binoculars saw the flag flutter above the haze and sent the message, "Omaha secure." It was a technical phrase, devoid of emotion, yet behind it lay a human truth. Victory begins not in triumph, but in the shadow of loss. Down on the beach, medics still moved among the fallen. The tide was coming in again, carrying with it fragments of wood, torn helmets, and silence. The water that had once been red was turning grey once more. For many, the day's outcome was still uncertain. The land beyond the cliffs was an unknown world of hedgerows and ambushes. But the beach, that beach, had been taken. The Atlantic wall had cracked, not through power or perfection, but through endurance. And as the morning smoke drifted inland, one truth settled over the survivors like mist. The invasion had succeeded, but the war for Europe had only just begun. By midday, the smoke began to thin. What it revealed was not triumph, but aftermath. The tide had retreated, leaving behind a landscape that looked less like victory than aftermath itself. Wrecked landing craft, twisted wire, helmets half buried in sand, and the dead, countless and unnamed, scattered between the waves and the cliffs. The sea that had carried them across the channel now lapped quietly at their boots. For hours the beach had been nothing but noise. Now the silence felt heavier than the gunfire had. Men moved slowly through it. Engineers, medics, survivors, each performing their tasks with the dull precision of exhaustion. Bulldozers rumbled forward to clear the wreckage. Engineers carved new exits through the dunes, hacking paths wide enough for tanks and trucks. The air stank of oil and blood. Seagulls hovered low, circling what was left of history's most ambitious hour. Medics worked without pause. Their voices, calm and measured, carried above the wind as they triaged the wounded, sorting, stitching, whispering morphine prayers. In makeshift aid stations beneath the bluffs, men who had survived the waterline now faced the slower, quieter battle against shock and time. The surgeons' gloves were slick with seawater and sand. No one looked up to see the flag above the cliff. Their war was measured heartbeat by heartbeat, breath by breath. For the first time since dawn, command began to speak again. Lines of communication, severed by chaos, were reconnected through field radios scavenged from the dead. Fragments of orders found their way ashore. Regroup, consolidate, advance inland. On the deck of the USS Ancon, officers marked the beachhead on their maps in red pencil. It was a narrow, fragile line, less a victory than a foothold, but it was enough. Omaha still burned, but it belonged to them. By early afternoon, reinforcements began to land. Waves of fresh troops splashed through the surf, their faces blank with disbelief at what they saw. Behind them, artillery rolled down ramps and into the shallow water, the guns of the 1st Division now setting up positions on ground, won only hours earlier by blood. The rhythm of battle had changed. The defenders' fire was sporadic, distant, losing direction. Above the bluffs, German command was faltering. In a small bunker near Colleville, General Kreis of the 352nd Infantry Division read the latest report and understood what it meant. "The enemy is pouring through," he told Berlin. "We can no longer hold them." His words, transmitted over crackling radio, carried the weight of the wall itself breaking, not in an explosion, but in surrender to inevitability. For the soldiers still on the beach, there was no sense of conquest, only endurance. They did not yet know that their advance would open the door to France, or that this single strip of coastline would one day be remembered as sacred ground. To them, the world had shrunk to a few hundred meters of sand and shale, a place where exhaustion met persistence and somehow became progress. By late afternoon, the engineers had pushed new roads up the bluff. Tanks rumbled inland. Stretchers lined the base of the cliffs. Chaplains moved among them, speaking softly, their words carried away by the wind. The beach was still haunted by the morning, but in the distance the sound of gunfire had shifted. It was now coming from inland. The front was moving. The day, impossibly, was turning toward evening. Omaha had not been conquered. It had been endured. Every bunker, every trench, every inch of ground had been taken not through brilliance or luck, but through attrition, through a million small acts of will. The Atlantic Wall had not fallen in a single strike. It had eroded one heartbeat at a time, and as dusk approached, the survivors of the longest morning lifted their eyes toward the hills of Normandy, knowing that the war was no longer behind them. It was waiting just beyond the horizon. By evening, the horizon over Normandy no longer burned. The thunder that had begun before dawn had faded to a dull, distant hum. The beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword were no longer isolated worlds of chaos, but a single, continuous front stretching 30 miles along the French coast. What began as 5 desperate landings had joined into one unbroken line. The invasion, fragile at sunrise, was now irreversible. Behind the beaches, the German defense was collapsing. What had once been a wall of fire was now a labyrinth of confusion. Scattered orders, broken radios, empty gun pits. Units fought in isolation, unaware that the line to their left and right had already been breached. By nightfall, the great Atlantic Wall, built over years, at the cost of millions of tons of concrete and the labor of a continent, had ceased to exist. Rommel's warning had come true with brutal precision. The first 24 hours will decide the fate of Europe, he had told his superiors months earlier. He was right, but when those hours came, he was hundreds of miles away, cut off by Allied air attacks, unable to command or even witness the undoing of his own defenses. The Reich had placed its faith in fortresses. The Allies placed theirs in motion, and motion, once begun, could not be stopped. As dusk settled over Omaha, the soldiers who remained alive turned from battle to the quiet rituals of aftermath. Engineers dug trenches for the living. The rest dug graves for the dead, shallow depressions in the same sand that had killed them. Helmets were placed as markers, rifles inverted beside them. Chaplains read over names that would never reach home. There was no music, no ceremony. Only the rhythm of shovels in the darkening light. The beach that morning had been the edge of the world. By nightfall, it was a gateway to liberation, to vengeance, to the long and grinding road across Europe that would end in Berlin. Yet the men who stood on that sand felt none of this. They were too tired to celebrate, too changed to believe that anything had truly ended. The sea behind them looked the same as it had at dawn, gray, endless, and cold. The tide was rising again, creeping toward the shore where the dead still lay. It washed over everything without distinction, friend and foe, victory and loss alike. The water carried fragments of wood and fabric, patches of uniform, unspent ammunition. The Atlantic, indifferent to the plans of men, resumed its ancient rhythm, erasing the footprints, but not the memory. Along the high ground, the first columns of Allied vehicles began to move inland. Tanks, jeeps, half-tracks, grinding over the same ground that had cost thousands of lives to take. Beyond the horizon waited hedgerows, fields, and villages that would demand a new kind of battle. But for this one evening, the war paused to breathe. The guns fell silent, and the wind returned. In the command tents, reports filtered in from every sector. Utah secure, Gold secure, Juneau secure, Sword secure, and finally, after hours of hesitation, Omaha secure. The message traveled across radios, through static and exhaustion, to ships anchored offshore, and to headquarters in England. It was not shouted or celebrated. It was simply acknowledged, like the completion of a task that had to be done. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress, Rommel's calculation, Tott's engineering, had lasted barely 1 day against the will of men who refused to stop moving forward. It had promised permanence. It had met endurance. As darkness covered the beaches, the tide rose higher, whispering against the newly dug graves. It cleansed nothing. It forgave nothing. It merely returned, as it always had, to remind those who survived that empires fall the way the sea rises, slowly, certainly, and without mercy. Every empire leaves its monuments to futility. The Atlantic Wall was one of them, and by the time the stars appeared over Normandy, the fortress had become its own tomb. When the guns finally fell silent, the numbers began to take shape. They were not strategy nor history yet, only arithmetic carved in blood. In the space of 8 hours, 2,400 Americans had been killed. Another 5,000 were wounded or missing, scattered across a beach that had no name worth remembering. The German defenders, around 1,200 dead, 3,000 captured or vanished into the countryside, had ceased to exist as a coherent force. The cost was counted not in miles gained, but in lives erased. In the official reports, the statistics appeared clinical, precise, detached. But for those who had lived it, there was nothing orderly about what had happened. The sand itself seemed to reject explanation. Helmets still lined the tide's edge like gravestones. Rifles stood upright where their owners had fallen. In the days that followed, engineers cleared wreckage, medics collected the dead, and the sea continued to deliver the missing. The tide, which had carried invasion, now carried grief. Reporters arrived 3 days later. They walked among the ruins with notebooks and handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The air still carried the smell of cordite, fuel, and death, a mixture no breeze could cleanse. One correspondent wrote simply, "It is not a beach, it is a wound." The photographs they took were muted, grey, almost reverent. They captured not the battle itself, but the weight of its absence, the stillness that follows only when the world has been torn open and left to settle again. Letters from the survivors began to make their way home. They were written in a language of restraint, each sentence a fragile bridge between horror and understanding. One private wrote to his mother, "It was a day no one should survive, but some of us did." Another ended his letter with a single line, "Tell them it was worse than the stories will ever say." These words, folded into envelopes and stained by salt, carried the true record of Omaha, the kind that would never appear in the archives of generals or governments. The military called it victory. Commanders analyzed it as a case study in perseverance, adaptation, and courage under fire. They spoke of coordination regained, of lessons learned, of objectives achieved, but the soldiers who had crossed that strip of sand understood something else entirely. For them, Omaha was not a triumph to be celebrated. It was an ordeal to be endured, and a memory to be survived. In the days after, the name began to circulate among the ranks. Bloody Omaha. It was not an official title, but it spread faster than any order. It carried both pride and warning, a recognition that what had been won was inseparable from what had been lost. When the High Command inspected the beach, they spoke in the language of necessity. "It had to be done," one general said. "There was no other way." Perhaps he was right. History, after all, often confuses necessity with inevitability. But among the men still digging graves in the dunes, such reasoning offered little comfort. They had seen what necessity looked like up close. As evening fell over the beach once more, the wind erased the last boot prints from the sand. The horizon was quiet again, the sea calm, the landscape deceptively peaceful. But beneath the surface lay the truth of that day, an unhealed wound beneath a calm facade. Some victories are too large for celebration. Omaha was one of them. It stood not as proof of power, but as a monument to endurance, and to the price men pay when the world demands the impossible and calls it destiny. And even as the tide returned to claim the shore again, it could not wash away the silence that remained. When word of Omaha reached Berlin, it arrived not as a report, but as disbelief. For 2 years, the German High Command had spoken of the Atlantic Wall as an immutable fact, a line of stone and steel that no army could cross. Now, in a single morning, it was gone. The communiques arriving at the Wolf's Lair were contradictory and panicked. Entire divisions missing, headquarters overrun, beaches lost. Hitler demanded clarification. None came. His fortress, the one he had built in concrete and propaganda, had dissolved beneath the tide. For hours, his staff stood in silence as the Führer paced beneath maps that no longer matched reality. The Atlantic Wall had been his illusion of permanence, a symbol of his regime's invincibility. That illusion ended on June 6, 1944. The unbreakable had been broken not by overwhelming force, but by endurance, the simple, human persistence of men who refused to stop advancing. In London, the reaction was the opposite of triumph. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, usually unshakable in defiance, received the casualty lists from Normandy late that night. The numbers were still incomplete, the ink still wet, but the meaning was unmistakable. He read them alone in the dim light of his study at Downing Street. Outside, the city that had endured the Blitz slept under blackout curtains. Churchill's cigar burned to ash as he whispered to an aide, "So many, but it had to be done." Then, for the first time since the fall of France, he allowed himself to weep. Across the Channel, the news traveled faster than any army. In Paris, in Warsaw, in the forests of Yugoslavia, and the mountains of Greece, the resistance heard it in coded broadcasts and whispered messages. They have landed. To men and women who had lived in the shadow of occupation for 4 long years, the words carried the weight of dawn. Hope, long buried beneath the rubble of Europe, stirred again. In the villages of Normandy, farmers emerged from their cellars and stared toward the coast, the distant thunder of artillery rolling through the fields like a storm retreating out to sea. For the Allies, the landings marked a beginning, not an end. The victory at Omaha was measured not in the ground gained, but in the myth shattered. The German army, the most disciplined, mechanized, and feared force in the modern world, had been stopped and then broken by ordinary soldiers who had refused to yield. The myth of invincibility that had carried the Reich from Poland to Paris began to erode in the surf of Normandy. By the following day, newspapers in neutral capitals printed headlines in disbelief. "The wall has fallen." In Stockholm and Bern, diplomats read the reports with careful astonishment. In Moscow, Stalin smiled grimly and sent a brief telegram to Eisenhower. At last, the Second Front is open. But even in victory, the Allies understood the cost. What had begun as Operation Overlord, the most complex military operation in history, had turned, within hours, into a test of endurance no planner could have predicted. The sound of its outcome rippled through Europe. It echoed in the halls of Berlin, where the architects of the wall now drafted reports on its failure, in the homes of the French, where resistance leaflets now spoke openly of liberation, in the fields of Normandy, where soldiers dug graves in the same soil they had fought to free. The wall of tyranny had not fallen to overwhelming firepower, nor to flawless design. It had fallen to persistence, to the unremarkable yet unstoppable will of men who had no choice but to continue. As the sun set over the beaches of Normandy, the surf whispered against the ruins of bunkers once thought eternal. The water rose and fell, indifferent yet constant, erasing footprints but not memory, and somewhere beyond that horizon, across a continent still in chains, people began to believe again that walls, no matter how vast, no matter how proud, can only stand until the day they meet the tide. Today, Omaha lies quiet. The surf rolls in slow, deliberate breaths, erasing the footprints of visitors who come to stand where history once screamed. The beach, once a graveyard of fire and steel, is now a sweep of calm sand under a pale Atlantic sky. Yet beneath its surface, the memory endures. Rusted helmets lie buried in the dunes. Fragments of shrapnel glint at low tide. And above the bluffs, white crosses stretch in perfect rows. Thousands of them, identical, unending. Each one marks a life reduced to a date and a name. Some are inscribed, others anonymous, the letters worn faint by 70 years of wind and salt. Together, they form a kind of silence more eloquent than any monument. Tourists speak in hushed voices, as if afraid to wake the dead. The sea, indifferent as ever, continues its rhythm. It rises, it falls, it carries the weight of memory out and back again. On calm mornings, the tide laps over the same shallows where men once crawled through smoke and blood. The water moves across invisible lines, places where the first wave fell, where medics worked, where brothers were lost. To the casual eye, it is just a beach. To those who know, it is a wound that never fully closed. Historians call it the price of freedom. They speak of logistics, strategy, the arithmetic of war, the necessary violence that opened the road to Paris and beyond. They call it decisive, even noble. But the men who survived rarely used such words. In their letters and interviews, decades later, they spoke of confusion more than glory, of fear more than victory. One veteran called it the cost of obedience. Another said simply, "We did what we were told, and somehow that was enough." The Atlantic Wall, once the pride of German engineering, exists now only in fragments. Concrete bunkers tilt at odd angles, their rebar bones exposed to wind and tide. Nature reclaims what arrogance built. Grasses grow through firing slits. Gulls nest where machine guns once stood. The sea, patient and relentless, has begun to erase the last evidence of the empire that imagined it could outlast time. And yet, Omaha remains, not as ruin, not as triumph, but as measure. The place where hubris met endurance, where certainty met will. The beach that was never supposed to fall became the one that defined a century. Every photograph, every footstep, every quiet moment spent gazing at the sea, here is a reminder that permanence is an illusion, and that courage often rises only when everything else has collapsed. When the veterans returned in their old age, they found the sand softer, the wind gentler, the silence deeper. Some wept, some saluted. Most simply stood and listened, to the sea, to the ghosts, to the echoes of a morning that shaped the modern world. They had come not to relive it, but to reconcile it, to understand how something so terrible could become something sacred. As the sun sets, the light shifts across the rows of graves, turning white marble to gold. Shadows lengthen toward the water, merging the living and the lost. The tide advances again, steady as breath, indifferent and eternal. They built it to last forever. It fell before noon,